The morning light cut across the hospital blinds like thin blades of glass. Machines hummed softly beside me, reminding me I was still alive, though part of me wished I wasn't. Heart surgery at 70 wasn't a death sentence, but being treated like an unwanted burden was. My name is Harold Whitman, and the day my son-in-law told me I no longer had a home, I realized the world had turned upside down. It started 2 months earlier. I had been recovering from surgery, staying with my daughter Claire and her husband Ethan in their 2-story home in Ann Arbor, just west of Detroit. My late wife Margaret had always said Claire had her smile and my stubbornness. But living there, I saw that she had inherited something else too, my silence when things hurt. Ethan didn't like having me around. He didn't say it outright, but you could feel it in every sigh when I asked for tea, every half-forced smile when I shuffled past him with my cane. He'd turn the television louder when I tried to talk, and one night I caught him whispering to Claire in the kitchen, "Your father's medical bills drained everything. We can't keep doing this." "Ethan, he's recovering. Just give it time," she whispered back. "He needs to sell that lake house. It's just sitting there rotting. We could use that money." I froze in the hallway. That lake house wasn't just a property, it was where Margaret and I built our lives, board by board. I could still see her sitting on the porch, sketching the morning fog over Lake Huron. Selling it was like selling her memory. I told myself they were only talking. People under financial pressure say cruel things they don't mean. I tried to believe that, until the envelope arrived. It came from the county property registrar's office, stamped and official. Inside was a transfer confirmation. The deed of the lake house, my lake house, had been reassigned. I stared at the papers until the words blurred. My name was there, in faded ink, right beside another signature that wasn't mine. When I confronted Claire, she looked away. "Dad, Ethan's handling some paperwork for you. You shouldn't worry about all this. Just focus on getting better." Her voice trembled, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. That night, I sat awake in the dark, listening to the faint sounds of the house that wasn't really mine anymore. My heart ached, not from the stitches, but from betrayal carving deeper wounds than any scalpel could. I didn't know it then, but that envelope wasn't the end. It was the opening move in a war they didn't know they'd started. And I intended to finish it. Most people in Detroit thought I was finished. A lonely, retired engineer, living off a thin pension, and the leftovers of a once steady career. I let them think that. It was safer that way. When neighbors saw me carrying grocery bags up the stairs of my apartment building, they nodded kindly, the way people do when they see someone they believe has outlived his usefulness. They never knew that the small leather briefcase I carried wasn't full of receipts or old prescriptions. It held contracts, quarterly reports, and stock statements. The truth was far quieter and far more dangerous. Back in the 80s, when I was a systems designer for the old Detroit Robotics Authority, I'd spent long nights building prototypes, servo modules, torque amplifiers, precision movement systems. Everyone else called them experimental junk. I called them the future. When the department collapsed during the recession, I bought out several of the early patents with my severance pay. Just scraps of code and incomplete schematics, everyone thought. But those scraps evolved. One of those projects became the seed of Motion Forge Labs, a small startup founded by a few of my old colleagues. They needed funding and guidance, so I gave both under a private trust registered in Margaret's maiden name. Today, that scrap company manufactures robotics components used in half the auto assembly lines in Michigan. Every quarter, royalties landed quietly in my secondary account. No fanfare, no paper trail tied to my name. I still remember the day I decided to disappear financially. It wasn't about greed, it was about freedom. You see, when people think you're powerful, they expect you to act. They watch you, challenge you. But when they think you're weak, they stop looking. They underestimate you. And in that blindness, you find your advantage. If people think you're powerless, I used to tell Margaret, you get to watch what they do when they believe you can't fight back. After she passed, I turned that philosophy into armor. I lived small, deliberately. A rent-controlled apartment, second-hand clothes, old furniture that squeaked when you sat on it. I kept a few model trains by the window, tiny engines with names like Freedom Line and the Iron Ghost. They gave me something to tinker with when the nights felt too long. To the world, I was just another widower, with oil stains on his hands and too much time on them. But behind the cracked blinds and flickering light, I was still working, still thinking, still building. And though I didn't know it yet, that disguised the mask of fragility was about to become the most powerful weapon I'd ever designed. The first snow of December had begun to fall when I realized the betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was legal, calculated, and complete. My recovery had gone well enough. The doctor said I could walk again without the cane if I stayed disciplined. What they didn't say was how to recover from finding out your own family forged your name on a deed. I went back to the lake house that week. I shouldn't have. I wasn't supposed to drive, but I did. The road that led there used to feel like freedom. That morning, it felt like a funeral procession. When I turned the corner by the birch trees, I stopped breathing. The porch railings were gone. Construction tape flapped in the cold wind. A pickup truck stood in the driveway, blasting music. Two men were hammering down my wife's old porch swing, laughing as they tossed it into a pile of debris. I stepped out of the car and shouted, "What are you doing?" The taller one barely looked at me. "Renovation. Owner's orders." "I'm the owner," I said. He gave me a look I'll never forget, half pity, half confusion. "Sir, the papers say otherwise." He pointed to a clipboard with fresh blueprints stamped Grayfield Holdings LLC. I took the paper. My name was still printed under previous owner, but beside it, in clumsy imitation, was my forged signature. It felt like ice in my veins. I called Claire immediately, but Ethan answered. "Dad," he said casually, like nothing was wrong. "Ethan," I rasped, "you sold my house." He paused. Then came the voice of a man who believed he was untouchable. "We sold it for your own good. You can't keep up with maintenance, and it's just wasting money." Claire and I made the responsible decision. Responsible? I could barely speak. "That house was your mother-in-law's soul. You forged my name." "Relax, Harold," he said, his tone turning sharp. "You should be thanking me. I'm protecting what's left of your legacy." Before I could answer, the line went dead. The world tilted. My vision blurred. The next thing I remember was the sound of my phone clattering to the ground and strangers shouting my name. I woke up under harsh hospital lights again. My nurse said they found me collapsed on the driveway near my car. Blood pressure spike, minor heart episode. When the doctor left, I turned my head toward the window. Snow fell quietly outside, blanketing everything in silence. For a long time, I just watched it pile up. And then, something shifted. The grief turned into something colder, sharper, purposeful. I whispered to the empty room, "If I walk out of here alive, Ethan will learn what it means to lose everything." Because he hadn't just taken my house, he'd taken my peace. And a man who's lost everything he loves is the most dangerous kind of man there is. When I left the hospital 2 weeks later, I didn't go back to Claire's house. I went home to my small, creaking apartment in downtown Detroit, the one everyone thought I'd settled for after retirement. To most people, it looked like a shoebox stuffed with old blueprints and coffee stains. But to me, it was a laboratory of memories and soon, a war room. The first night back, I laid out every document I had. Hospital bills, tax forms, the fraudulent property transfer. My name forged like a mockery across the bottom line. Ethan had done this with confidence because he believed I was weak, half senile, harmless. He had no idea that the man he robbed had spent 40 years designing control systems for machines that never forgot, never forgave, and never failed. That night, I poured a glass of whiskey and opened an old metal drawer. Inside lay a folder marked Motion Forge Labs Private Holdings. Most people thought I'd sold my shares decades ago when the company rebranded, but I hadn't. I still owned 35%, hidden through a trust registered under Margaret's maiden name. For years, I'd stayed quiet, collecting dividends, while the world thought I lived on a meager pension. I told no one, not even Claire. But now that silence had value. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Deborah Klein, an old colleague from my engineering days. She picked up on the second ring. "Harold," she said, cautious, "you sound different." "I'm done playing patient," I replied. "I need you to pull records on a company called Grayfield Holdings LLC. Find who owns it, where it's registered, and who filed the last transfer deed for my property in Alpena County." She hesitated. "Are you sure you want to open that door?" "I'm not opening it, Deb. I'm tearing it off its hinges." Within 3 days, she called back. Her voice was low and tight. "It's not just some company. Grayfield is a shell under Linden Realty Ventures. And guess who signed the incorporation papers?" My knuckles whitened around the phone. "Ethan Blake." That's right. He didn't even bother hiding it properly. As she read the report, something darker settled over me. Ethan hadn't just sold the property, he'd used it to take out a bridge loan. The house wasn't fully paid for, he'd mortgaged it under my name, betting on his next business deal. He was gambling with my legacy. That night, I sat in the dim light of my apartment, the city's hum outside my window. I wrote in my old leather notebook, the same one I used when drafting robotics schematics. He sold my house before he even owned it. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt alive. Not with hope, but with purpose. Ethan thought I was finished, but he'd just given me a reason to start again. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Ethan wasn't just greedy, he was sloppy. And sloppy men always leave trails. I began by calling Deborah again, this time asking for a quiet referral. Someone young, discreet, and willing to do the kind of digging that didn't leave footprints. She sent me a name the next morning. Riley Moore, a paralegal in her late 20s, who had a reputation for finding what others missed. We met in a small cafe across from the courthouse. Riley arrived with a laptop under one arm and a stack of files that looked heavier than she was. She didn't bother with small talk. "Your son-in-law registered multiple shell companies last year," she said, opening her screen. "Grayfield Holdings, Linden Realty, and something called Silver Axis Consulting, all connected by the same bank account under a business loan he took from Pinecrest Capital. The collateral? Your lake house." I felt the room tilt. So he used my property to fund his business? Exactly. And he's been moving money between accounts, hiding it under fake maintenance fees. Classic embezzlement pattern. Riley slid a photo across the table. Ethan shaking hands with a local investor at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Behind them was a banner that read, "Silver Axis Innovations, Building the Future of Green Energy." I couldn't help but laugh softly. Building the future on stolen ground. Over the next few weeks, Riley and I worked in secret. She taught me how to read digital bank footprints, how to trace the ghost signatures back to Ethan's devices. At night, I'd sit at my desk surrounded by notes, coffee cups, and the faint hum of the city beyond the window. Each document I uncovered felt like another nail in his coffin. Claire still called occasionally, her voice distant, strained. She said Ethan was stressed about work, that he'd been drinking more, that investors were asking too many questions. I told her not to worry. Things have a way of revealing themselves when you least expect it. She didn't catch the weight in my words. By early March, we had enough evidence to bury him. Fake invoices, altered signatures, hidden withdrawals, even voice recordings of him discussing creative accounting with his business partner. Riley looked at me across the table one evening and said, "You could take this straight to the police." I shook my head. "No, not yet. If I hand it over now, he'll cry, misunderstanding, settle quietly, and go back to his games." "So what's your plan?" I smiled. to let him think he's winning. That night, I sat by the window, the city lights reflecting in my glass of whiskey. Ethan thought he'd stolen from an old man too tired to fight. He hadn't realized yet he'd just given that old man a reason to remember everything he'd ever learned about precision, patience, and pressure. And this time, the system I was building wasn't made of metal. It was made of consequences. The first rule of engineering is simple: never reveal the system until it's fully built. The same goes for revenge. 2 months after my last hospital visit, I called Ethan. My voice trembled just enough to sound harmless. "Ethan," I said softly, "I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe you were right. Maybe I held on to the house too long. I want to make things right for Claire." There was silence on the line. Then a shift in his tone. The suspicion melted. "I'm glad to hear that, Harold," he said, pretending to sound gracious. "It means a lot to Claire." That's when I baited the hook. "I've been speaking with some investors. They're interested in acquiring a robotics patent I worked on decades ago, something called Axis Torque Technology. They want to pay a consulting fee to someone younger, someone who can help navigate the business side. Maybe you?" The moment I said it, I could hear the greed ignite in his voice. "Well, that's generous. We should definitely talk about it." And so we did. Over the next few weeks, Ethan invited me to dinners, acted kinder, more attentive. He brought flowers for my small apartment, told me I looked stronger these days. I played my role, fragile but grateful, the foolish old man trying to make amends. In truth, every word was recorded. Riley had set up a small encrypted device in my watch, something that looked like a simple timepiece but logged every conversation. Each time Ethan bragged about his business instincts or hinted that he could help manage my investments, the file grew thicker. One night, I invited him over for dinner. The old lake photographs hung on the wall. He stared at them longer than usual. "You really loved that place, huh?" he said. I smiled. "Still do. Some things are worth rebuilding." He didn't notice how long my eyes lingered on the voice recorder blinking faintly between us on the table. By the end of dinner, he was drunk enough to start talking. He boasted about deals, about money no one would ever trace, about how he'd handled the property issue. I poured him another drink and nodded like an old fool. When he left, I shut the door and whispered to myself, "Got you." The next morning, Riley and I went over the recordings. Every confession, every arrogant word was there, clear as daylight. She stared at me. "This is enough to destroy him, Harold." I nodded slowly. "Not yet. I want him to walk into his own execution thinking it's a promotion." The plan was simple. MotionForge Labs would host its annual shareholders meeting in Detroit in April. Ethan thought he was attending to sign consulting papers for me. He had no idea he was walking into the one place I controlled entirely. The place where masks would finally come off. The morning of the meeting, Detroit was dressed in gray mist, the kind that hangs heavy, blurring the skyline like a secret. It felt appropriate. I arrived at MotionForge Labs an hour before everyone else. The marble lobby gleamed, the air faintly metallic, the smell of progress. The receptionist looked up, startled, as I walked in wearing a tailored navy suit. It had been years since anyone at the company had seen me as anything other than a retired relic. "Mr. Whitman," she said, "do you have an appointment?" I smiled. "I built half the automation systems in this building, dear. I think I'm allowed to visit." Upstairs, the boardroom was a glass-walled cathedral overlooking the city. I placed my folder neatly on the table. Documents, voice recordings, property transfers, all neatly labeled. Across the top sheet, a single word was written in bold: evidence. At 10 a.m., sharp, the room filled with executives and shareholders, and then Ethan walked in. Expensive suit, confident grin, hand extended toward me. "Harold," he said warmly, "you didn't tell me it was such a big meeting. I could have brought a presentation." I kept my smile measured. "No need, The presentation's already prepared." He chuckled nervously and took a seat. He thought he was here to sign consulting paperwork that would give him a share of my non-existent patent sale. He didn't know this meeting had been called by the board, not me. The company's CEO, Dr. Mason Reed, entered and took the head seat. He glanced toward me. "Mr. Whitman, would you like to begin?" I rose slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for tension to settle like dust. "Most of you don't know me personally," I began. "But decades ago, when this company was just an idea scribbled on a napkin, I was here. I invested when no one else would. And I stayed silent as the company grew, collecting dividends quietly, while watching who we became." Ethan smirked, clearly impatient. I turned to him. "Ethan Blake, you're here because you believe I'm transferring consulting rights to a new project. That's what you told your wife, yes?" He frowned. "Yes. Isn't that what this is?" "No," I said evenly. "This is an audit." His face stiffened. "An audit?" Dr. Reed folded his hands. "Your father-in-law brought us some rather serious documents." The projector flicked on. Screen after screen appeared bank transfers, forged signatures, property deeds, audio clips. And then Ethan's own voice filled the room. "Relax, Harold. You should be thanking me. I'm protecting what's left of your legacy." The sound was unmistakable. His smirk cracked, replaced by panic. "What is this?" he snapped. I stepped closer. "That's your voice, admitting to forgery and misappropriation. The same voice that told investors you had collateral you never owned. My lake house." The room went deathly still. One board member whispered, "Is this real?" Dr. Reed nodded. "Completely verified. We've had our legal team cross-check every document." Ethan's hands trembled. "Harold, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I cut in. "You thought I was a frail old man too tired to fight back. But you should have known I spent 40 years teaching machines to catch human error." He stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. "You can't do this!" Dr. Reed's calm voice broke through. "Actually, Mr. Blake, we can. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending criminal investigation." The guards at the door stepped forward. Ethan turned to me, his face pale. "You ruined me." "No," I said quietly. "You ruined yourself. I just made sure the lights were on when you did it." As they escorted him out, I felt neither triumph nor regret, only stillness, like a storm had finally spent itself. Outside, the snow began to fall again. News travels fast in Detroit, especially bad news. By the next morning, Ethan's face was on every business feed, his name trending under number Forgery Fraud Detroit. MotionForge Labs issued a formal statement confirming his suspension and cooperation with authorities. The once smug man who bragged about building the future had been reduced to a headline about greed. I watched the coverage from my apartment, the volume low. They showed him being led out of the building, his head bowed, his hands trembling. For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. Claire called that afternoon. Her voice was cracked and small, the way it used to sound when she scraped her knees as a child. "Dad, what did you do? What needed to be done? Ethan's being investigated for fraud. They're saying he used your house as collateral. Why didn't you come to me first?" "Would you have believed me?" I asked quietly. Silence. Long enough that I heard her breath shake. "He said you were confused after surgery, that you made mistakes." I closed my eyes. "And you believed him?" She didn't answer. That night, I drove to the lake house. Snow still covered the front porch where they'd torn down Margaret's swing. The construction equipment was gone, the property locked up, abandoned mid-renovation. It looked broken, half old, half new, like a body split between two lives. I stepped inside through the side door I'd built myself in 1983. Dust floated in thin beams of moonlight. The smell of sawdust still lingered. I touched the wall where Margaret's painting used to hang and whispered, "It's yours again." By spring, the court ruled in my favor. The deed was restored, Ethan's loan voided, and Grayfield Holdings dissolved. The judge's final words echoed in my mind. It appears the defendant grossly underestimated the intelligence of the plaintiff. Ethan's world collapsed. His investors sued him. His accounts were frozen. The house he bought for appearances was repossessed. Claire filed for separation after finding messages between him and one of his business associates, another betrayal in a long list. She came to see me once, standing at the lake's edge in a heavy coat. Her eyes were hollow. "He's gone," she said simply. "I know," I replied. "I saw it coming long before you did." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't even know who to be angry at anymore. Him or you." "Be angry at the choices, not the people," I said. "That's what age teaches you." She left without another word. As the sun sank behind the frozen water, I sat on the rebuilt porch with a cup of black coffee. The quiet was different now, not peace, but aftermath. Ethan had lost everything. I had reclaimed everything. And yet, for some reason, the victory didn't taste as sweet as I thought it would. Because revenge, I was starting to learn, doesn't end the story. It just leaves you holding what's left. Spring arrived late that year. The snow melted slow, exposing pieces of my past buried under ice and time. I spent most mornings restoring the lake house, sanding the porch rails, fixing loose boards, and hanging back Margaret's old photographs. The house began to breathe again. For the first time in months, I felt almost at peace until the day I found the envelope. It happened by accident. I was repairing a frame that had fallen from the study wall, a watercolor of Lake Huron that Margaret painted our first summer here. When I removed the backing to replace the cracked glass, something slid out, a small brown envelope sealed with wax, marked in her handwriting. "For Harold, if you ever lose faith in Claire." My chest tightened. Margaret's handwriting had always been steady, looping like music. I sat at the desk, turning the envelope over in my hands before opening it. Inside were two things: a short letter and a folded legal document. The letter read, "Harold, our daughter is kind, but she is easily led. Promise me that if she ever betrays our trust, you will remember that love sometimes blinds the good-hearted. I've given her partial ownership of the house to protect her in case we're gone too soon. But if she lets anyone misuse that gift, don't forgive easily. Make her understand value, not pity." I unfolded the second document. My pulse stopped. It was a co-ownership deed signed nearly 20 years ago, listing Claire Whitman as co-owner of the lake house. That meant she wasn't just an uninvolved bystander when Ethan sold the property. She had legal power to stop it. She could have prevented everything. I leaned back in my chair, the paper trembling in my hand. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. "Don't forgive easily." For hours, I sat staring at the lake through the window, trying to make sense of it. Claire hadn't been trapped. She hadn't been powerless. She'd chosen silence. I remembered her voice on the phone, fragile and trembling. "He said you were confused." No. She wasn't confused, she was complicit. The betrayal, I thought, came from Ethan's greed, now had another name: my daughter's. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the halls of the house, every creak of the floorboards sounding like Margaret's footsteps, like judgment. She had left me the truth, hidden behind a painting, and now I had to decide what to do with it. Forgive blood, or teach it a lesson. By dawn, I already knew my answer. The next afternoon, I called Claire. My voice was calm, steady, too calm. "Come by the lake house tomorrow," I said. "There's something you need to see." She hesitated. "Dad, I don't think I can handle another argument." "It's not an argument," I replied. "It's a reckoning." She arrived the following morning, her car pulling into the gravel drive just as the mist lifted from the lake. She stepped out slowly, looking around as if she barely recognized the place she'd grown up in. Her eyes were red, her shoulders heavy. Inside, I had laid the letter and the deed on the table, the ones Margaret left behind. Claire's eyes darted to them the moment she entered. "What's this?" she asked. "Something your mother wanted you to see," I said. "She wrote it in case you ever forgot who you were." I watched as she read the letter, her lips moving silently over each word. When she reached the end, her hands began to shake. "I didn't know she—" "Yes, you did." I cut her off gently but firmly. "You knew you were co-owner. You could have stopped Ethan. You could have protected what she built. Instead, you let him destroy it." Her voice broke. "Dad, I was scared. He said if I interfered, we'd lose everything. I thought I was protecting our family." "By betraying it?" I asked quietly. Tears slid down her cheeks. "You don't understand. He controlled everything. The money, the house, me." I froze. I looked at her for a long moment, trying to find the girl who used to run barefoot through this house, chasing her mother's laughter. All I saw was a stranger weighed down by excuses. "I don't hate you, Claire," I said finally, "but I can't trust you, and trust is the only inheritance worth leaving." She buried her face in her hands. "What are you going to do?" I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope from my updated will. I placed it on the table between us. "You've already been removed," I said quietly. "Everything goes to your children now, when they're old enough to understand what integrity means. Maybe then, they'll learn what you couldn't." She looked up at me, her face pale. "Dad, please." I shook my head. "You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked softly in the corner. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a whisper from the past. When she finally left, she didn't look back. And for the first time in my life, I understood what Margaret meant in that letter. Love without accountability isn't love at all. It's permission. Spring bled into summer, and with it came the quiet that always follows a storm. The courts finished their work. Ethan was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. His company was dissolved, his assets seized. Newspapers called it the Whitman scandal, but they missed the real story. It wasn't about money. It was about how far betrayal can travel through blood. Claire filed for divorce shortly after the sentencing. She sent me a letter I couldn't bring myself to open for weeks. When I finally did, the ink was smudged from tears. She wrote that she'd started therapy, that she wanted to rebuild her life for the sake of her children. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She only wrote, "I understand now what I let happen. I'm sorry I didn't stand beside you when it mattered." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside Margaret's. 2 confessions, decades apart, one written in hope, the other in regret. The lake house was quiet again. I spent my days repairing the roof, replanting the garden, repainting the porch swing that Margaret once loved. Sometimes I'd catch myself talking to her while sanding the railings, telling her how it all ended. The neighbors began to visit again, curious about the old engineer who took down a fraud ring. One even brought me a newspaper clipping with my name on it. I thanked them politely and tucked it away. I didn't need reminders. The victory was hollow enough on its own. Every night, as the sun fell over Lake Huron, I'd sit on the porch with a mug of black coffee, the smell of cedar and water drifting in the air. Peace, at last, but not joy. Revenge gives you closure, not comfort. I thought about Claire's children, the next generation, who would one day inherit this place. I hoped they'd never learn hatred the way their parents did, that they'd remember the lake not as a battlefield, but as home. When the wind rose across the water, it carried Margaret's voice again in memory. "Don't forgive easily, Harold, but don't forget why you loved in the first place." And for the first time in years, I understood her. Justice had been served. But justice, I realized, is never clean. It always leaves residue. 5 years passed. Seasons folded into one another, and the world moved on. But the lake never changed. It still caught the sunrise the same way Margaret painted it 40 years ago, silver and gold over still water. quiet enough to hear your own breath. I'm 75 now. My hands shake a little when I hold a pen, but I still write every morning at the same oak table facing the water. Today, I'm writing a letter to my grandchildren. Not about inheritance or money, about choices. One day, I write, you'll learn that strength isn't about what you build. It's about what you refuse to destroy. The world will tell you that forgiveness is weakness. It's not. It's clarity. But never confuse forgiveness with forgetting. The people who hurt you will often smile while they do it. Don't hate them, but don't hand them the knife again either. Outside, the wind moves through the birch trees, and I can almost hear Margaret's laughter blending with the sound of the water. I think of Claire sometimes. She sends postcards from Chicago now, where she works as a teacher. Her handwriting looks steadier. The last one said, "The kids love science, Dad. Maybe that's from you." I smiled when I read that. Maybe healing doesn't arrive all at once. Maybe it comes in fragments, a letter here, a quiet apology there, a moment when you realize the weight you carried isn't quite as heavy anymore. The lake house stands stronger than ever, painted pale blue like it was the summer Margaret and I first built it. The porch swing creaks again, and every time it moves, it feels like forgiveness has taken a seat beside me. I raise my coffee toward the horizon and whisper, "You were right, Margaret. Love and justice can live in the same house, but they rarely sleep in the same room." As the sun lifts over the water, I feel no anger, no pride, just calm. The kind that comes when you've survived the worst and learned the simplest truth of all. Power fades, wealth disappears, but integrity, if you guard it, outlasts everything. And when people underestimate you, let them. Because when you finally rise, the silence that follows will speak louder than any revenge ever could.